Come see us on tour in Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.
What do you mean the military is in ruins? Because we hear that we spend so many multiples more money on our military budget than any other country, the multiple countries combined. So we don't think it's in ruins, but you say it is. In what sense do you mean that?
What if I hold out of storage a Ford Fairlane 500 from 1961, and I gave it a new coat of paint, I put some new tires on it, I tried to tune up the engine, change the oil, and then I presented it to you as the car of the 21st century? What would you say?
Is our equipment outdated in that way?
Well, my point is that's the Department of Defense.
Right.
You're dealing with an institution that was constructed in a couple of years after World War II. We got this thing called the 1947 National Security Act. Well, the 1947 National Security Act was a disaster because what it did is it codified the way we had fought the Second World War. When Eisenhower was shown it, he said, well, this is terrible because that's not the way we should organize to fight in the future. But he had very little influence at that point. And when he became president, all the usual suspects on the Hill and in industry had aligned themselves with the new status quo. And he had a lot of problems to deal with, and he did not have time or energy or longevity in office to fundamentally reform and change defense. So my point to you is that the Department of Defense is an anachronism. It's not organized in a way that makes any sense for the world of technology and battlefield intelligence that we have today. It's not designed for our needs, and we don't have the right incentives for people to join it. We are not recruiting the best. In many respects, we're getting much less than the best. Let's put it that way. And our service academies are another example. They've turned into watered down universities where boys and girls go to college together. And we're paying through the nose for it. It's a lot of nonsense. We should be graduating out of the military academy razors, people who are looking for a fight and are ready to fight. That's not what we're getting. We've lost our way completely. We haven't even talked about diversity, inclusion, and equity, let alone affirmative action. Affirmative action has been declared unconstitutional. That still persists. We need to get rid of all this stuff. We need to build a new force for the future. And everybody's against that. Nobody wants to do it because they're worried about the money. Well, do I still get paid? Where's my money going? Right. People in Oklahoma, people in Florida, Mississippi, their revenue says, well, wait a minute, what does that do to the shipyards? What does that do to the cannon factory out front? I mean, let me give you a good example of the problem. In the 1930s, when Douglas MacArthur was chief of staff of the Army, he wanted to mechanize the horse cavalry. That's 1931, 32. Sound reasonable? Time to build tanks, armored fighting vehicles. And you know what he was given? He was given enough money to buy 2 French tanks that were already obsolete. They wouldn't give him any money. Now, what was one of the big reasons he couldn't do anything about these regiments of horse cavalry? One of the biggest reasons was as follows. The horses produced tons, millions of tons of manure. That manure was loaded onto trains and went all over the Middle West and South in order to be used as fertilizer on farms. It was an industry. Right. If you eliminate the horses, you eliminate the horse manure. Now remember, this is before the Green Revolution. This is before we had all of the pesticides and various chemicals that we use now. We were dependent on horse manure. So the Hill said, no, forget it. We're not going to fund it. We're not going to go along with it. So you got a problem. You've always got a problem with domestic priorities that frequently trump national necessity. It's only when you get a war and the threat of violence is so real that you've got to make changes that you get away with it. Marshall went through the same thing when he was chief of staff. So this is part of it. The other part of it is, of course, the generals that you've got. They don't even know the structure they're in. They don't know where it came from. They don't understand why it developed and evolved into what it is. They're all very narrowly focused, and they don't want to change a thing because it got them where they are.
Right.
This is not new. That happened to us in 1939 at the beginning of the Second World War. That's why Marshall had to retire vast numbers of general officers.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is from first principles, the whole department is structured incorrectly. And that presumably, I mean, this is my interpretation, but I think this is, you would agree with this. Without facing an existential threat, a lot of culture war ideas have gotten into the way the military is structured that probably would not survive serious outside pressure or existential threat.
Well, I think that's true, and you have to blame to some extent Hollywood, because Hollywood creates fiction that all too frequently is then internalized as reality.
Are you saying 100-pound women cannot beat up 6'4" Russian soldiers?
Yeah. I know there was a great film with Hugh Grant playing a film score writer or film writer of some kind who ends up out of a job and has to go teach English. And he makes a suggestion, well, let's have a new story and let's have a man who's a real kick-ass hero instead of another girl who's a kick-ass hero. Right. And of course, he's immediately decimated by everybody in sight for being a misogynist and a dinosaur and all this. Look, if you got a bunch of World War II veterans or Korean War veterans and put them in front of a lot of the movies that we have today, they'd all throw up. They'd laugh. Say, you've lost your minds. It makes no sense. The best example, I think, is still Starship Troopers. Did you ever see that?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and what's his name? Robert Heinlein that wrote that thing. He was a Naval Academy graduate, and he was talking about the Army and the Navy and the Pacific. And there were women in it, and they were pilots. Here's a news flash. Women as pilots are successes. The problem is when they get shot down. But the point is they're very good pilots. They have better hand-to-eye coordination and push-button facility than men. But everything else that was
they
on
also
the
don't
planet,
have to use turn signals.
Yeah, all the that's right. All the real combat missions were in the hands of men, of course. But you know, if you try to tell somebody that things aren't like that, then they look at you and say, "Well, Colonel, I know a young woman here who was in Iraq, and she did this, and you don't know what you're talking about." Well, unfortunately for everybody, there were very few instances of what I would call real knockdown, drag out, kill or be killed combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. Right. And frankly, much of that was executed by special operations infantry. And they did it very well. But the last time we met an army in the field that had any capability was in 1991. We've been fighting people in sandals and bed sheets with AK-47s and remotely detonated mines. Now, that's not to diminish somebody's service. It's just a reality. It's the difference between World War I in 1914 and the British fighting, people in Africa or India. They went to World War I, and the army that was brilliantly trained and well-equipped was almost annihilated in the space of 60 days. War is something else.
Are we even going to fight that way in the future? You know, Elon, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, he released a video that purportedly was from China that really looked like something out of dystopian science fiction, where there was just this swarm of perfectly coordinated drones moving in unity across the landscape. So we're going to look more like that or than a World War I hand-to-hand combat or direct combat?
I think you have to go to the battlefield in eastern Ukraine and you find out certain things very quickly. Are you going to see swarms of unmanned systems of various types and kinds? Yes, but then you're going to have to understand what you're dealing with. A lot of these swarms are programmed for follow me. In other words, you don't have a human brain mind behind every drone. So one operator will operate a certain number, and within that flock or swarm, there are drones that are simply told to follow the drone next to them. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, yeah.
So, I mean, the illusion of this independently minded swarm that can make decisions in split seconds that a human being would make and make good ones, that's a little misleading. And what the Russians have demonstrated is that the swarms can be shot down.
Right.
And that's something we have to come to terms with. We forget that when aircraft came into being and we had manned aircraft and they ended up with equipment that allowed them to bomb people, and then we gave them radios and so forth. For long periods of time, they dominated everything until someone could shoot them down. Mm-hmm. And in those days, that tended to rely heavily on another air force. Well, now we have all sorts of devices that can jam signals, that can disrupt guidance that comes from satellites or from ground stations. So the supposition that a particular advance in this fluid environment of the air is going to change everything immediately is misleading. Oh, it's going to change the way you fight. I mean, I know that we had virtually no air defense with us in 1991. And that was for the very simple reason that the United States Air Force swept everything out of the skies, which was very nice.
Now, when you say 91, you're talking about Persian Gulf War, yes?
Yeah, Desert Storm. So we didn't have to worry about, aircraft attacking us. We didn't have to worry about drones attacking us. The Air Force took care of that. Now, we did have to still fight because we suddenly had very, very bad weather, and we had no close air support. We had a little bit at the beginning, but when the time came, we had none when we crashed through the enemy. Those are just the breaks. Bad weather makes a difference. Now, today, we can do a lot through bad weather that we could not do then. But my point is there's always a countermeasure for any measure. So before you conclude, well, we don't need anybody like that anymore, or we don't need that, whether it's a tank or a truck, or it's a rifle, or it's a machine gun, we can get rid of everything. It's dangerous. Because what you always need when you go to war is a diversity of capability. And then you figure out what the right mix is in training, and then that mix is employed to effect. So I think what we have to do right now is not end up being beguiled by what a Marine Corps commandant once called the Spielberg effect. Mm-hmm. He used to pull his hair out because he said, every time I turn around, somebody's presenting me with some new gadget that promises the world. It's the Spielberg effect. We've seen too many Star Wars movies.
Come see us on tour in Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and only there.